today we're going to be doing a review of part 2 of Unit 2. And yeah, let's do it. So you can follow Fiveable at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And office hours are uploaded to YouTube, by the way, which is pretty cool. And again, we're just going to be doing a brief review of part 2 of Unit 2, and then we'll transition into a Q&A if anyone has any questions. So the first thing that I wanted to cover was the concept of like market equilibrium and then consumer and producer surplus. So last week in our office hours, we talked about supply and demand individually. So when we put them together on a graph, that gives us the graph of just like a standard market. So like suppliers, buyers, producers, consumers, that kind of thing. So market equilibrium is where supply and demand meet. So that would be this point right here. And at market equilibrium, the quantity is Q1, like at least on this graph, and then the price is P1. So consumer surplus is basically like when a consumer is like willing to pay more than the actual price and like kind of like what they're getting out of it, or like profiting, I guess. So there's like two types of consumer surplus. So if we're just looking at an individual's consumer surplus, that would be what they're willing to pay, like the price that they're willing to pay minus the price that they get. So if we were talking about like a set of headphones and I was willing to pay up to $300 for that set of headphones, but the market price right here was actually $250, my individual consumer surplus would be $50. And the other like type of consumer surplus would be like market consumer surplus. So that just means that that's essentially referring to this graph right here. So a market is, it's comprised of like multiple individuals. So the consumer surplus in a market is all of these individuals added up to the equilibrium price. So to find the market consumer surplus, you would just use the formula to find the area of a triangle. So half times the base right here times the height, which is, the upper price minus like the market price. And actually, I can go ahead and just draw it out on this board right here. Okay, so right now we have a graph that kind of looks like this. So this is our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price. And we're saying that this is all consumer surplus. And that makes sense because along this demand curve, so let's say that this price up here is $11, and then this price right here is $6, and then this is $1. So there's consumers like along this demand curve. So like consumers here, 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 all the way up to here. So all of these individual consumers are willing to pay up to a certain price for an object. That's what demand is. It's what you're willing and able to pay for a product, basically. So just looking at this individual consumer, they're willing to pay $11, but the market price is actually $6. So their consumer surplus would be $5. And then this next one is willing to pay $10, and then the market price is $6. So their individual consumer surplus is $4. So as you like go down the curve up to the equilibrium quantity, of course, that gives us the entire consumer surplus for the market. And just like keep in mind that anyone past this point, so like if I was only willing to pay $5 for the product, I'm not going to get it because supply only allows us to like have this quantity available in the market. So if I'm only willing to pay $5 and all the other consumers are willing to pay more for it, obviously they're going to be able to buy the product because the market price is $6 and I'm only willing to pay $5. Yeah, so going back to this. The next thing is producer surplus. So producer surplus is like the same thing except applied to producers. So it's the market price subtracted. So like the market price minus what a producer is willing to sell for. So again, there's two like different types of producer surplus. There's individual producer surplus, which is again, just like market price minus what they're willing to sell for. So like, let's do the headphones again. The market price was $250, but a producer is willing to go as low as $200 because they can still make a profit with $200. Their producer surplus would be $50 because they're getting $50 more dollars from the purchase than they like intended, I guess. And the market producer surplus would again just be this whole like triangle. It's bounded by the supply curve and the equilibrium price line. And it's just all of the producer surpluses in a market like added up. So we can go back to this again and let's do yellow this time. So this would be our producer surplus. And you know, there's producers along this curve willing to go as low as these prices, and it's all of their individual producer surpluses added up. So this one's willing to sell for 2, but they're getting a price of 6. Their producer surplus is 4. 6 minus 3 for this one would be 2. And all of that added up to the equilibrium point is the producer surplus for the market. But of course, if a producer is willing to only sell at a price higher, no one's really going to buy from them because the market price for the product is $6. So why would anyone go above that to like actually purchase the product? So yeah, you can't go past the equilibrium point in this case. And another thing I would like to mention is that at this like state of market equilibrium, when like supply equals demand and they're normal, the total surplus is maximized. So total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So if we're not at equilibrium, those are the total surplus, like the sum of CS and PS is decreased. Okay, so when there are like changes in equilibrium in a market, there are things called like surplus and shortage. So as you can see in this graph, there's the equilibrium price right here, excuse me. So the equilibrium price is right here at like 250, I guess. And when price level increases, so let's say it increases to like 4, you can see that quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So quantity supplied is at about 50 and quantity demanded is about 20. So we have about 30 more of that product being produced at a price of 4. So that means there's a surplus. So basically any price above equilibrium price is going to give you a surplus, and then any price below equilibrium is going to give you a shortage. And a shortage is the exact opposite. So quantity demanded is higher than quantity supplied. So like at a price of 1, quantity demanded, again, it's about 50, and then quantity supplied is about 10. So there's a shortage of 40 because demand is higher than supply. Like quantity demanded is higher than quantity supplied. And another thing about like market disequilibrium, so markets are always fluctuating. There's always changes happening in markets. And at the last office hours, we actually talked about the individual determinants of supply and demand, and that essentially means like what shifts the supply and demand curves. So like for supply, that's things like taxes, subsidies, the amount of suppliers in the market, expectations of future price, stuff like that. And then for demand, it's like how many consumers are in the market, the tastes and preferences of the consumers changing, again, future expectations of price, like the prices of substitute and complementary goods. So those are like examples of determinants of the supply and demand curve. So when those determinants like change, so let's say like for demand, consumers, like if we're talking about milk and consumers start like disliking dairy milk and start looking for plant-based alternatives, obviously demand would shift left because they want less of it as a whole. And that can lead to changes in price and quantity. So we can graph this one again. Okay, so always make sure to label your axes. So let's just use the like dairy milk example that we were going with. So we said that demand would shift left because consumers are starting to prefer less of the dairy milk and they're looking for other substitute goods instead. So that means our new demand curve would be like right here, for example. And remember to draw this arrow to show the direction of the shift. And our new equilibrium price and quantity would be down here at P1 and Q1. So our price is decreasing and our quantity is decreasing. So that kind of like shows the example of how shifts in the supply and demand curves lead to changes in equilibrium price and quantity. And just because we can also, let's also do an example of supply shifting. Okay, so let's say that, let's not do taxes and subsidies yet because I'll get to that later, but let's say that we're talking about like the leather handbag market and the price of, let's just say that like cows become less available because of like a disease that like is running through the cow industry, and now there's less cows to produce leather, which is an input for the leather handbags, and that would decrease supply. So our new supply curve would be right here. Let me do equilibrium price and quantity as well. I forgot that. That is not a Q. So our equilibrium price and quantity are here. So as you can see, since we have a decreased supply, we have a decreased quantity, but we have an increased price. So yeah, that's how a decrease in supply would affect equilibrium price and quantity. And of course, like going the opposite direction would have the exact opposite effects, like price would decrease and quantity would increase when supply shifts right. And there's also double shifts in markets sometimes. So that's basically when both demand and supply shift at the same time. So like let's like do milk again. Consumers demand less milk because they want vegan alternatives, but they also like the cow market, like the cow market is like decreased because there's less cows available. So let's just like draw that. And that would be an example of both like supply and demand shifting. So we said that consumers demand less milk because they wanted vegan alternatives. So I'll draw that. So D1, oops, let me draw our equilibrium price and quantity. And our supply is also decreased because there's less cows available, and cows are obviously an input for dairy milk. That was a bad supply curve. So our demand and supply decreases. So our new equilibrium price and quantity is somewhat like this. So like Q1, P1. And something special about double shifts is that there's always like one thing that's indeterminate. So when like demand and supply shift, obviously like price and quantity change, but when both of them shift at the same time, at least one of those things will be indeterminate. And indeterminate basically means that we can't necessarily determine if it increases, decreases, or stays the same. So just now we talked about a decrease in demand and a decrease in supply. So our equilibrium price would be indeterminate and our equilibrium quantity would decrease. So we can kind of see this on the graph actually. The quantity definitely decreases by like a significant amount, but like you can see how the original equilibrium price and the new equilibrium price, they're kind of like ambiguous. Like you can't really tell. Like it's really based on how much the supply and demand curves shift individually, and that's the only way we can know what the new price actually is. Like, is it higher or lower? Because if my supply actually decreased all the way up to here, our price would have actually increased. But again, that's based off of how much the curves shift on their own. So so there's this like chart right here. Obviously, like you can like memorize it if you want, but I think it's good to have a conceptual understanding of what happens. So let's like kind of like think about it. So supply is decreasing in this case. And remember, like in the last example, when supply shifts left or decreases, our price increases and our quantity decreases. And at the same time, our demand is decreasing on this. That is not a D. So our demand is decreasing. So when our demand decreases, our price decreases and our quantity decreases. And now we can actually see what's indeterminate and what's not. So since we're combining a decrease in supply and a decrease in demand, quantity in both of these situations decreases. So this is determinate. Like we know definitively that when both of them shift, quantity is going to decrease. But as you can see, when supply and demand both decrease, price is increasing in one case and price is decreasing in the other case. So that's indeterminate because it really depends on how much like supply and demand shifts. So if demand shifts left more than supply shifts left, then we're going to have an overall price decrease, and like vice versa. So obviously you don't need to like actually do that part, but you just need to be able to identify what's indeterminate. In this case, it would be price, and what's determinate, which would be quantity. And of course, this applies to like all of the other things. Like, so if demand increases, supply increases, demand increases, supply decreases. It's pretty much the same concept, except for like a good way to remember it is when like demand and supply like go in the same direction, like price is indeterminate, but like when they go in opposite directions, quantity is indeterminate. And again, like writing it out or graphing it out like we just did can really help with like understanding the double shifts instead of just like memorizing them. Okay, and the next thing is government intervention in markets. So like governments always are intervening in markets through like taxes, subsidies, things like that. So the first thing I wanted to like look at was price ceilings. So price ceilings are when the government believes that the market price for a certain good is too high and they want to impose a maximum price for that good. And for a price ceiling to be binding, and binding basically means effective, it has to be below equilibrium price. And I know it's kind of confusing because a price ceiling is below and like a price floor is above, but just remember that it's like flip-flopped. So our price ceiling has to be below equilibrium price because we're setting a maximum price. And if our maximum price is above equilibrium or like at equilibrium, it's not really going to do anything. So it has to be below to be effective. And a real life example of like a price ceiling is rent control. So like in New York City, it's a big city, there's a lot of demand for apartments there. Landlords often try charging a lot for rent because they know that they have a lot of people like fighting to get the same apartment. So they try charging as much as possible. So that's when like the government would step in and have rent control to make sure that landlords can't charge obscene amounts for rent just because they can. So let's like analyze this graph with the price ceiling now. So again, we know that there's equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Our price ceiling is marked here by PC. And at the price ceiling, our quantity supplied is actually lower than the quantity demanded. So our quantity supplied is at B, quantity demanded is at C. And remember that like in a few slides ago, we talked about how like when QD is greater than QS, there's a shortage because there's a lot more demand for that good, but like less supply because obviously for a lower price, suppliers want to produce less of a product, but for a lower price, consumers want to buy more of that product. And when we have this like price ceiling imposed, we can like draw some new lines where they intersect the demand curve. So this is like the main one that we're looking at. And once we draw all of these like new lines, we can see that there's this like triangle off to the side called deadweight loss. So deadweight loss just refers to any kind of inefficiency in the market. So that means that we're actually like decreasing our like total surplus in this case. And remember, we talked about how at equilibrium price, our total surplus, which is CS plus PS, is maximized. So since we're not at equilibrium price and we're setting a limit below, there's inefficiency now. So total surplus is decreasing. And when total surplus is decreasing, that means that there's deadweight loss in the market. So if you're ever asked to solve for deadweight loss, that's just we just use the triangle formula. So that would be half times base times height. And in this case, like your height would be the equilibrium quantity minus the new quantity supplied, and your base would be the price ceiling minus whatever price this is, wherever this like quantity supplied line intersects the demand curve. And our consumer surplus is the green area, and our producer surplus is the blue area. So like consumer surplus, it kind of like expands down here now because again, if consumers are willing to pay like these higher prices, and they used to be able to get they used to get this equilibrium price, but now they're getting this even lower price at the price ceiling. That means their consumer surplus like stretches out vertically, and producer surplus is like down here. It like gets really small because obviously like the price is super low, which isn't like the optimal conditions for a producer, but overall total surplus decreases when there's a price ceiling. And there's also like things called price floors, which are pretty much the exact opposite of price ceilings. So for a price floor to be binding, it has to be above equilibrium price. So a price floor is basically setting a minimum for a price if the government believes that the market price is too low. So an example of this would be like for farmers, a lot of the time, they are not getting like paid enough for their crops as they should be. So the government can step in and create a price floor and set a minimum which is higher than the equilibrium price to make sure that they're getting like a higher price paid. And again, the floor is on top. It's weird. So just looking at the graph again, the price floor is up here at PF, and the amount supplied at the price floor is QS, and then QD is down here. So at the price floor, QS is greater than QD, so that means that there's a surplus, which again we talked about, like anything above equilibrium price pretty much, like that whole area is usually regarded as a surplus. And again, there's deadweight loss because there's inefficiency in the market. Once we draw these like dashed lines down, it's easier to see what the deadweight loss is. So just like make sure to draw all your dashed lines on when you're like graphing stuff. So yeah, the deadweight loss, again, you're losing efficiency because your total surplus is decreasing. It's getting like pushed, like it's getting like shrunk. And the consumer surplus is like this little triangle up here. It gets really small because, again, consumers are getting like, they have to pay a much higher price now. So their consumer surplus is decreased, and producers, they are getting a higher price now. So that expands their producer surplus from like where the equilibrium price was to where the price floor is. And yeah. And I forgot to mention, like, if you're being asked to find the area of consumer and producer surplus on these graphs, you can like kind of like break it up usually, but usually you won't be asked to find the actual like value of it. So that's when you would find the area, if that makes sense. So like, if you're being asked to find like the dollar amount of like the consumer surplus, obviously you would do like half times base times height in this case. And like for producer surplus, you would add up this rectangle plus the area of this triangle. But usually College Board just likes to make sure that you know where the consumer and producer surplus are. So consumer surplus would, on this graph, like the non-numerical value, it would be referred to as like whatever value is up here, and then BPF. So it kind of like describes the vertices of that triangle. It's kind of like how geometry, like we call shapes like ABC, like triangle ABC, things like that. And then like in this case, producer surplus would be like 0, PF, B, and then whatever label this point right here would be, and that refers to that whole area. So there's also things called subsidies. So subsidies are when the government is actually paying producers, like they're giving them money to increase production of a good. So like flu vaccines, obviously the government wants producers to make more of those because like it's just for the general good. Or like renewable energy, the government can provide subsidies for like solar panel companies, for example, because solar panels are pretty expensive to like manufacture and install and like keep up. So the government can actually like pay those companies to keep producing. So subsidies, obviously, they're like suppliers are being paid, so supply would increase, which decreases equilibrium price and increases equilibrium quantity, which is exactly what is intended. And excise taxes, so excise taxes are a specific type of tax in which they're like a tax that's per unit. And per unit basically means that it's a tax being charged on each unit of the good being produced. So like if we were talking about like Coca-Cola, like each pack of 6 has like a tax of like 10 cents levied on it. But this is like different than a lump sum tax. It's not an excise tax. A lump sum tax is just like a sum that the company has to pay. So like just paying like $10,000 annually to keep producing a certain product rather than paying an individual tax on each unit of the good. So excise taxes are usually levied on goods that the government wants less of being produced. So like alcohol and cigarettes, like the government wants their supply to decrease for the most part. So that's exactly what happens when there's a tax. Obviously, like people want to produce less of it because it costs more. So supply like shifts left. And this graph has like a lot more going on it. There is inefficiency because it's like a tax and it's like shifting away from what the equilibrium price and quantity would be. So this triangle right here, bounded by the new equilibrium, the old equilibrium, and the bottom, like wherever this like new quantity is and where that intersects the supply curve. So that's our deadweight loss. Our consumer surplus shrinks and our producer surplus shrinks. And that is actually tax revenue now, this like rectangle. So if you can see my pointer, the consumer surplus actually used to be from point, let's call this point P. So from P to PE to where the old supply and demand met, but now it's shrunk upwards. And that amount right here is the tax revenue, and same for producer surplus. So producer surplus, like it used to be this like bigger triangle down here, and now it like shrunk to this smaller triangle, and all of that like shrinkage is now converted into tax revenue, and whatever is left of to the right of that quantity is deadweight loss. And to find the actual value of the tax, you just find the vertical distance between the two supply curves. So like the point, like any vertical distance along the supply curve will usually give you the same amount, but yeah, if you just did like PT minus whatever, let's call this like PA, so PT minus PA, that would give you the actual value of the tax. So like this could be 4, this could be 2. That means that there's a $2 per unit tax in this market. So tax incidence basically is talking about whether like consumers are carrying more of the tax or like producers are carrying more of the tax, because taxes actually impact both consumers and producers. So to remember like the rules for tax incidence, I like to use the acronym EPIC. So when demand is comparatively more elastic than supply, the burden, the tax burden, falls on producers. That just means that producers pay more of the tax. And when demand is comparatively inelastic, like more inelastic than the supply, the burden falls on consumers. So consumers pay more of the tax. And you can kind of see this on these graphs right here. So demand and supply are relatively like unit elastic to each other. They have like the same slope kind of. So the consumers and the producers are paying like, they're kind of paying like the same amount in taxes. They're paying, so consumers are doing, they're paying 30 in taxes overall, and producers are paying 30 in taxes overall. So both of them are paying 30. Yeah, and for the next graph, demand is more inelastic, like it's more like steep, the slope. So that means that consumers are paying more. So you can see there's like a bigger triangle for consumers and there's a smaller box for producers. So that means that consumers are paying $5 in the per unit tax and producers are only paying $2 of that tax. And for when demand is relatively more elastic than supply, consumers are paying less than producers. So in this case, consumers are only paying $2 of that tax and producers are paying $5 of that tax. And to find the total value of the tax, it would just be 12 minus 5, which is 7. That was what I was like referring to as the vertical distance between the two supply curves. And also, like, this equilibrium line is like what separates, the old equilibrium line is what separates the consumer's tax and then the producer's tax. So like whatever part of the tax revenue box that's above the old equilibrium price, that's what the consumers have to pay in taxes. The actual like distance would be the per unit tax, and the area of that would be the total amount of taxes, because like it's the value of the per unit tax multiplied by the quantity. So like per unit times quantity equals the total amount of tax. And then same for producers. Whatever is below the equilibrium price is, and it's still in that like tax revenue box, is what producers have to pay of the tax. So it would, that vertical distance would be the actual per unit tax that producers have to pay, but the overall taxes that producers have to pay would be that vertical distance multiplied by the Q1. And lastly, there's international trade and public policy. So a quota is when a government, like, it limits the amount of a good that's coming into a country, like international goods. So you can see, you don't need to know like the graph of a quota for the AP exam, but it just kind of like helps you visualize what it looks like. So you can see that SQ right here is the quota. It's like limiting the amount of an international good that's coming into a country. And there's tariffs. So tariffs are like when like the government places like a tax on like foreign goods coming into a country, and that helps protect domestic goods, because obviously like foreign produced goods are a lot cheaper, like when they're coming from other countries that are, you know, more known for like manufacturing things versus like domestic goods. So when you're placing a tariff on a foreign good, that like increases the price, and that helps protect domestic markets, like domestic goods. So before trade, our market price was PE and QE, that's just equilibrium price and quantity. The world price, so when our borders are completely open, our world price is all the way down here, and that comes from other countries being like better at manufacturing things. So like for example, China, they have a lot more factories, they can produce things for a lot cheaper, so that's why the world price is so low. And at this world price, quantity demanded is a lot higher than quantity supplied, which makes sense. And on this graph, this actually, like the shortage is actually the amount that needs to be imported. So this graph, like the actual supply and demand curves, are referring to domestic supply and domestic demand. I think I forgot to mention that. But when domestic demand is all the way here at Q4 and domestic supply is only at Q1 at this super low world price, this gap, so Q4 minus Q1, has to be made up with by importing goods. And then when you add a tariff, obviously price increases because it's kind of like a tax, except for international goods. Um, the difference between the quantity supplied and quantity demanded like decreases. So now we're at Q3 for our quantity demanded and Q2 for our quantity supplied. So now there's a smaller amount. So Q3 minus Q2 is a smaller amount that needs to be made up by like importing goods. So a tariff allows for domestic suppliers to be able to provide for like goods up to like a certain point, and then the rest can be imported. So it just decreases the amount that needs to be imported from another country. And yeah, it's Q&A time now. So if you have any questions about any of the units, feel free to drop some questions in the chat. And yeah, I'll just wait for like 5 more minutes for like any questions to come in. And if not, I'll just like end the office hours. So yeah, I'll just wait. And if any questions come in, I will answer them. And questions from any units are welcome, by the way. And while we're waiting for questions, I actually realized that I forgot to mention something. So if you're ever asked to find like the consumer surplus on these graphs, it's like unique for international trade graphs. So for consumer surplus, the original one at equilibrium price would be FAPE, but for the world price, it would actually be FCPW. It would like go past. So it's like this huge triangle right here. Yeah, and then it like goes past the supply curve. And then for the price with the tariff, it would be FBPT. That would be the triangle. So yeah, again, feel free to ask questions. I just needed to mention that. yeah, so it's been about like 5 minutes. There's no questions, I think. So yeah, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Bye.